Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the Conservative Case for Planning with our featured speaker, Chuck Marohn. I'm Jessica McKelvey Kemp, the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy with the Center for Planning Excellence. We are so pleased to have Mr. Marohn with us today and want to extend special thanks to our sponsor, the Downtown Development District of Baton Rouge, for helping to make his participation in CPEX's 10th Annual Smart Growth Summit possible. As an engineer, urban planner, smart growth advocate, and a committed conservative, Chuck Marohn has a lot to offer those of us in Louisiana who may approach smart growth and planning from a more conservative perspective or be tasked with practicing within a more conservative context. Chuck Marohn's background as an engineer and planner and his consulting work for dozens of cities and towns across his home state of Minnesota has given him an intimate understanding of how land use and infrastructure projects get designed, funded, and built. This unique insight across what have traditionally been siloed practices is what led him to start his organization, Strong Towns, in the wake of the national financial crisis that left so many local governments reeling from the sudden halt in development. Strong Towns is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that helps America's towns achieve financial strength and resiliency. They travel the nation to promote a complete understanding of the cost associated with communities' methods of growth, and they advocate to address those costs via productive changes in development patterns. Chuck is the author of Thoughts on Building Strong Towns and A World-Class Transportation System. He is also the primary author of the Strong Towns blog and host of the Strong Towns podcast and See It Differently TV. Over the past 5 years, Chuck has worked nationwide with public officials, staff professionals, and local citizens to help them find a new path forward to becoming strong towns and communities. Here in South Louisiana, the 2007 Louisiana Speaks Plan, which was developed as a vision for how our region would rebuild after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, revealed that more than 80% of the 23,000 residents polled had a preference for changing Louisiana's sprawling land use and development patterns in favor of concentrating development within existing footprints and increasing connectivity with multimodal transportation choices. Nearly 10 years later, we have to ask ourselves if we are making meaningful progress toward that vision. In the Baton Rouge area, we are seeing traffic congestion worsen continuously, while growth is occurring most rapidly in areas outside the city limits. Budget shortfalls for maintaining our existing infrastructure are at the top of mind for most of our elected leaders, and discussions of building the new infrastructure we need to relieve the congestion that is compromising our quality of life and hampering our economic prospects can seem futile in the absence of any identified revenue sources. So, how do we get to this point? And how can we change our trajectory so that we are growing according to the vision we have set for ourselves and growing in a way that is financially responsible and sustainable? These are really tough questions. So, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck to shed some light on our dilemma that is shared by so many municipalities throughout the nation. Chuck Marohn.
Thank you so much. I often think that there's two kinds of conservatives, and I'm going to paint with a broad brush here, but there are the I don't want change kind of conservatives, which is kind of the original notion of what a conservative is, where you're going to assume that people know what they're doing, and when we change from that, it makes us freaked out. And I get that, I understand that, I am very much that way. I think the other kind of conservative is what we might today call a fiscal conservative, the idea that we need to be prudent, financially conservative with our resources. And to me, this presentation is going to deal to a degree with both of those. I tend to sympathize with both of those points of view, and this is how I have kind of come to understand our development pattern and the way we have built and designed our places. Our organization, Strong Towns, started as a blog. We still blog today. I'll give you the address at the end and all the stuff you need to follow up. Our mission is to support a model of growth that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to grow financially strong and resilient. I want you to think back to how cities were built thousands of years ago, and just ponder for a minute the way these places were put together. If we think about it, we understand that they were built around the dominant transportation technology of the day, that of course being your 2 feet. People walked everywhere, and so the layout, the design, the spacing, the distance between different types of things you would do on a normal day, this was all scaled around people who walked. We can fast forward thousands of years to, this is my hometown. I live 2.5 hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. We got a little bit of snow yesterday. I'm excited about that. This is the way it looked like in 1904. And if you arrived here by stagecoach, you arrived here by train, once you got here, you got off and you walked everywhere that you went. And so the layout, the design, the spacing, the distance between different types of things you would do on a normal day, all this was consistent with what we had seen for thousands and thousands of years. Beginning in the early 1900s and then accelerating after World War II, we began to build cities around a different transportation technology. We began to build cities around the automobile. We came up with different building types, different building styles, different ways of arranging things on the landscape. If we were to go out and ask 100 random people today to explain this transition, they would likely talk about it in terms of progress. We used to be people who walked, we build cities around people who walked. Now we are people who drive, we build cities around people who drive. Someday we will have jet cars, and we will build cities around people with jet cars, and someday we will teleport, and our cities will look completely different than they do today. This is a narrative of progress. And it's very comforting and affirming to us because it puts us on this path of things continually getting better. I want to give you a different way of looking at this that isn't so comforting and affirming, but I think is really important to understanding where we're at today. When we look at these ancient cities, this is ancient Ur on the left, about 5000 BC, ancient Rome on the right. When we look at these cities, even though they're ancient, they're a long, long time ago, by the time we got to this point in human civilization history, humans have been building cities for thousands and thousands of years. The technology to do this was gained the hard way, through trial and error. When we built things, if it worked, we copied it and expanded on it. If it didn't work, we threw it away and didn't do that again, right? And when I mean didn't work, I mean people died, civilizations failed. By the time you get to my hometown in the early 1900s, you have a style and a pattern of development that had been perfected over thousands and thousands of years through trial and error experimentation. Different cultures, different continents, different latitudes had built in a style and form that was incredibly strong and resilient. When we look at this style of development, even though this is what most of us have ever known, this is the way things are done, right? We have been doing this a very, very short period of time. The knowledge to do this didn't come from trial and error experimentation. We didn't try this out, in Mississippi to see how it would work, watch it percolate for a couple hundred years, and then, migrate the best ideas to here. Right? We just did this everywhere, all at once, all at the same time, across an entire continent. It's important to understand that we are living in one of the greatest experiments that's ever been tried. One of the greatest social, political, cultural, and land use and building experiments. And we often don't appreciate that because this is all we've ever known, right? Today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ramifications of this development pattern that maybe weren't clear to people when we first started out on this approach. When we look at the ways we experience growth today, the way we have jobs and growth and economic development, it's fundamentally different than what we saw 100 years ago. 100 years ago, if Baton Rouge, for example, was going to experience growth and jobs and economic development, that was going to be a byproduct of things that happened here. Today, we have 3 different mechanisms of growth that were not available to cities and to local residents 100 years ago. The first one is transfer payments between governments. The idea that the federal government, the state government, as our partner in creating jobs and growth and opportunity, does things like provide grants and loans and infrastructure programs and different things that allow us to make investments here to create jobs and growth. The second is transportation spending. The idea that we pool our dollars, we use those to build major infrastructure projects, highways, interchanges, overpass, transit lines, frontage roads. These create jobs while they're being built and then have a platform for future growth and development. The third mechanism is debt. While public debt is an important part of this conversation, even more important is private sector debt. The ability to get long-term financing with little money down at low rates, have that sold off on a secondary market, packaged, securitized, bought up by people around the world. Creates enormous amount of liquidity that allows us to experience growth, create jobs, and have prosperity. We take these mechanisms, we use them for growth, and of course at the local level, the growth is good because it gives us a tax revenue we need to do the things that we want to do. This is kind of city administration 101. When we step back and we realize the powerful incentives at play, we see that the cost for these transactions for local governments, for local taxpayers, is very nominal. The federal government comes in with a grant, the state comes in with a program, the Department of Transportation comes in with a big project, or the private sector comes in with finance dollars to build buildings and other, residential and commercial places. As a city, we pay a very small percentage of that overall transaction. We might have to upsize a pipe, we might have a little bit of staff time, but generally, the millions of dollars being spent are being spent by someone else. The benefit that we get immediately, however, is substantial. Now we have all this new tax revenue coming in, we're feeling very wealthy. The catch is that we as local governments agree, as part of these transactions, that we will assume the long-term responsibility for servicing and maintaining all this stuff. We agree that we will go out and fix the roads and the streets and the curbs and the sidewalks and the pipes and the pumps and the valve. Those will become our long-term responsibilities. What we are doing, in a sense, is exchanging a near-term benefit in cash for a long-term obligation. If you think this through over a long period of time, in other words, if you think we're going to be around as long as ancient Rome, right? We want to be a civilization that we're not building for one generation or two, we're building for the long term. There's only one of two ways that this strategy makes any sense. Either growth is going to continue at ever accelerating rates. It's going to be always that much more new growth we can generate, and we can take that revenue and we can make good on all the promises we made generations ago. Or the pattern of development, the way we actually build and assemble our places, is going to generate for us more wealth and prosperity than it does long-term expense. Now, we've all been around long enough to see our economy do this, right? We all understand that we're not going to grow at ever accelerating rates, even if it were mathematically possible, which it's not. We have enough real-world experience to know that's not the way things work. Unfortunately, this second assumption is also not true. And this is where, for a few slides, this presentation will get a little bit technical. I'm an engineer and I have to do some of that. So it won't be painful, I promise. One of the early things, it is so cool having people way up there. One of the, I keep waiting to see the Queen. She's here, yeah. One of the things we did early on at Strong Towns is we went and tried to measure the parts of our development pattern that we could actually measure. Engineers, planners, economic development advisors, they have this thing that we've come to call the quantum theory of economic development. It's this idea that, well, this project might not make any financial sense, this project might not make any financial sense, this project might not make any financial sense. When you add them all together, something magic happens and we get growth and prosperity. You can't measure that, Chuck. We disagree with that. So we went out and actually tried to measure this stuff. We said, all right, there are parts of our system that we should be able to get really good measurements on that really only exist to serve the part that's being served. This is kind of the prime example of that. This is a dead-end road with a cul-de-sac. This road only exists to serve the residential properties along it. There's no through traffic, there's no commercial traffic, it's just there for them. This was built in the mid-1990s. The city went out and paved it. The city paid half the cost, the property owners paid the other half. We asked the question, all right, based on the amount of revenue the city's collecting from these property owners, the only people who really substantively use this road in any way, how long is it going to take them to recoup the half that they just spent to build it? The answer is 37 years. Now, the road's not going to last that long, right? But when it does fall apart, it's 100% the city's responsibility to go out and fix it generation after generation after generation. This is another development. This is a closed loop system, again, with a dead-end cul-de-sac. The only reason this road exists is to serve the people that live there. There's no through traffic. There's no commercial traffic. This was built in the early 1980s. It was paid for by the developer, rolled into everyone's mortgages. People have been paying taxes for years. Now the road fell apart. The city had to go out and fix it. The cost to do that was $354,000. We asked the question, all right, based on the revenue the city's collecting from the property owners within this development, how long is it going to take them to recoup the money they just spent to fix it? The answer is 78 years. We then asked the question, all right, how much, if we were going to try to raise enough money from these property owners between now and the time their road fell apart to actually have the money to go out and fix it, what would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, with annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. The sewer, the water, vastly more expensive. Now, sometimes people say, okay, Chuck, I get it. We lose money on residential, we make it up on commercial. Commercial's our cash cow. My response to that is always great. I don't know any corporation that loses money on 90% of what it does, tries to make it up on the last 10%. I don't know why an incorporated municipality would find that to be a wise strategy. Nonetheless, one of the kind of ways we lie to ourselves is to say, if we just have enough commercial property, it doesn't matter what happens with residential. This is a business park. This is one of those build it and they will come investments that cities like to do. The wide industrial streets, full utilities. We built this and tried to attract new growth in. This business park is completely filled up. Every single lot is built upon. The city looked at this as such a vastly, massively successful project that they said, we want to do it again on property we own right next door. We're actually going to take this development and just mirror it, build the exact same thing right here. We said, all right, if we could build the exact same thing with the exact same amount of money and get the exact same amount of investment, would that be a good deal? In today's dollars, it would be $2.1 million. There's $6.6 million of subsequent investment. Now pause here for a second and understand, of that investment that has taken place, 4 of those lots are a church. 2 of those lots belong to the school district. It's a school bus maintenance facility. 1 of the lots is a county maintenance garage. 1 of the lots is a city maintenance garage. These are all important public facilities, right? I mean, churches are a very important part of our community. The school district is a very important part of our community. We need these maintenance buildings. I get it. But none of them pay any taxes to the city. Of the remaining lots, the ones that theoretically are private sector taxpayers, every single one was either sold for $1 and or were given a long-term tax subsidy in order to attract them to move into this park. For the sake of our analysis, we assumed that every single lot would be built on within 12 months by a full tax-paying, non-subsidized entity, and that every single penny of new revenue would go to paying off that bond. If that were the case, it would still take the city almost 3 decades, 29 years, just to break even. That's 29 years where everybody else's taxes would need to go up to pay to plow the snow, mow the ditches, provide police protection, fire protection, and every other service that is needed. And that's in the most wildly optimistic scenario. I used to go through and do about 15, 20 of these. I was so proud of them, I just wanted to share them. People would start to cry after a while, and I found that I can make the point in just 3. If you're someone who wants more of this, more data, I'll give you our website at the end. There's a lot of case studies on there. Let me show you what's going on. And again, I apologize. I'm an engineer. I like charts. I know some of you aren't chart people. I will walk you through this one. Let's say a developer comes to town. So I have this piece of property I would like to build upon. I am willing to, at my expense, build all the residential homes, all the commercial buildings. I'm willing to, at my expense, put in all the necessary infrastructure. I'm not asking for any variances from your code. I'm not asking for any subsidies. The only thing that I'm asking as a developer is that when I finish building this stuff, that you, the city, agree to take it over and maintain it. What would we say? We say, fantastic, right? You mean you don't want any subsidies? You're going to meet all of our rules? You're going to build everything that costs us nothing? I had one city council member once say, you mean we get a free road? Yeah, you get a free road. Let's say that we're smart, prudent people, right? And we know that we have this long-term obligation that we're taking on as part of this transaction. So as part of doing this, what we're going to do is when the money from this new development comes in, we're going to take the portion that would normally get spent other places, fixing and maintaining stuff, and we're just going to set that aside. And every year when that money comes in, we'll set that portion aside and we'll allow it to accumulate so that when we get out a generation and we have to make good on that promise, we'll have a pot of money to do that. This is what that looks like. In year one, everything is brand new. Money comes in, we take that portion and we set it aside. In year two, we add to what we had in year one. In year three, we add a little more and a little more and a little more as the years go on. You can see a 5-year-old road isn't cost you anything. A 10-year-old pipe isn't cost you anything. You get out a couple of decades and you've got quite a bit of money, right? You're feeling very, very rich. The problem is when we get to the day we have to make good on that promise, what we find is that the cumulative amount of revenue is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, we run far into the negative. Now, cities are not one development, right? Cities are a collection of developments. They're a collection of neighborhoods. So let's say that our developer comes back in a couple years later and says, you know, that project worked really well for me, it worked really well for you. I would like to do a similar size project. And in fact, every other year from this point forward, a developer walks in the door with a similar size proposal. In other words, the ideal scenario for any city, nice, steady, continuous growth. And we take that money and we set it aside and we save it for the day we have to make good on these promises we're making. This is what that looks like. In year one, you've got your first development. It pays in the entire 25 years. Year three, you've got another. Year five, you've got another. And you can see, not only do you not have any costs, but now all of a sudden you have growth upon growth upon growth. Your cash actually starts to accelerate upwards. You're feeling very, very wealthy. And yes, while you've got to spend a little bit of money in year 25 to make good on that very first promise you made a generation ago, it's not a big deal, right? You've had all this growth. The growth creates what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we all intuitively understand, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. If you lose money on every project that you do, the further you go out in the time horizon, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. This is why our cities, despite following all the rules, despite following all the programs, despite having intelligent, thoughtful people who are doing great planning on where this pipe should go and where this road should go, are now finding themselves financially without any options. Do you recognize this? This is human nature, right? This is why people smoke. I'm smoking and then, oh, I've got emphysema, right? This is why, you have that extra bowl of ice cream and don't go for a jog, right? I'm going to have that bowl of ice cream, I'm going to sit on the couch, and then, oh no, I've got heart disease, right? We are wired as human beings. We are wired as human beings to place enormous value on pleasure today and to deeply discount pain that will happen subsequently decades from now. That's the way we are wired. Why is this different than the way cities have been built for thousands of years? It's very simple. What happened to the cities that did this thousands of years ago? They don't exist anymore. They weren't around to be copied. They weren't around to be copied by others. We are in a huge experiment today. We're way out here. I'm going to show you one more chart It's the most depressing one. Then we'll get on to other things. As this chart here, this is a chart of debt. Everybody in this room is familiar with our national conversation on debt, right? Our national debt is huge, trillions of dollars. It's an unfathomable sum of money. When I was in grade school, we had the Weekly Reader. You guys have the Weekly Reader? Who said that over? Yeah, you had the Weekly Reader. I love the Weekly Reader. I remember in 4th grade, there was a little breakout box. It said if you took the national debt and turned it into dollar bills and stacked it on top of each other, it would go to the moon and back 23 times, something like that. You know, as if for a 4th grader, replacing one abstract concept with another abstract concept would clarify everything, right? These are unfathomably huge sums of money. When we look at this chart here, the bottom line, the blue one, that's the growth in our GDP since in our national debt since World War II. The black one right above it, that's the growth in our GDP. This green one, the one that soars up like that, that's the growth in our private sector debt. That's debt we share. It's home mortgages, commercial real estate loans, auto loans, credit cards accounts, margin interest accounts, student loans, private sector debt. The way we finance the first generation of this new experimental way of building is by using our savings and by reinvesting that illusion of wealth back into more growth. When things started to drag in our economy, when that illusion of wealth started to vanish, think mid-70s, early 80s, it took us a while to figure out what to do. But we eventually shifted from an economy based on growth through savings and investment to an economy based on growth through debt accumulation. And growth through debt accumulation is such an important part of our economy today that we've actually allowed it to become predatory. We actually have allowed systems to arise that prey on our friends and neighbors. We encourage people who can't afford homes to buy homes. We could afford small homes to buy large homes. We could afford large homes to buy multiple large homes. Our ability to continue this experiment by having our neighbors take on accelerating levels of debt is simply not there. Obviously, there's some huge implications to all this. The mechanisms of growth that we become accustomed to are waning. The federal government, the state government are both vastly overcommitted. Our DOTs have built way more lane miles than they have any reasonable expectation of budget to just maintain, let alone expand. The DOT, or the private sector is overtapped. What this means for local governments is that we are going to be forced to absorb the cost of our development pattern. If we want that road fixed, we have to pay for it. If we want that pipe repaired, that money is going to have to come from us. This can't be done in the current pattern of development without some incredibly large tax increases and/or some devastatingly large cuts in services. Now, I didn't come here to tell you what you already know, right? Everybody in this room is familiar enough with local government or government at every level to know this is a conversation we're all having, right? How big is the tax increase going to be? Who's going to pay for it? How deep is the service cut going to be? And where is that going to be felt? It is critical that we see the third variable in the sentence, the third variable being the current pattern of development. As long as we continue to build in a way that is functionally insolvent, there is no way our cities are going to avoid insolvency. As long as we continue to build in an approach that gives us an illusion of wealth today in exchange for enormous long-term liabilities, there's no way our cities are going to avoid default. Whether that is a hard default, like we see in places like Detroit and Stockton and San Bernardino, or whether it's a soft default, like we see in thousands of cities around this country, where they're laying off police officers and firefighters, putting off critical maintenance, closing libraries and parks. We have to start having a conversation about how we build financially productive places. So how do we do this? I was in, about 3 years ago, I did a tour of sorts in California. We did 11 talks in 6 days, started in Northern California, ended up in San Diego. And over and over again, I was asked at the end of the presentation the same question. Chuck, you've come here, I get what you're saying, I'm not gonna argue with anything, it seems right, but gall dang, you didn't give us the solution. I'm really angry with you. What is the solution to these problems? And it took me a while, because I'm from Minnesota, to understand what these Californians were saying. Because I was hearing them say, what's the solution? What they were really saying was slightly different. They were really saying this: what can someone else change about what they're doing so that I don't have to change anything about what I'm doing? I know of no such solution, right? We've tried all of those. We've tried all of those. What we have created for ourselves is a very complex set of problems, a complex set of interwoven, interdependent problems that defy a solution. So at Strong Towns, we don't talk about solutions. What we talk about is something we call rational responses. How do thoughtful, intelligent, rational people working together in their community, looking at this complex set of problems, roll up their sleeves and actually start to deal with it? And when we talk rational responses, we always start with this photo here. This again is my hometown back in the early 1900s. And when I first saw this photo, I was just blown away. I was blown away. I looked at this and I said, this is a brilliantly designed street. The way the buildings line up, the way they frame the public realm at just the right classical ratios, right? There's great segmentation of the public space. The buildings have great symmetry. They front the public realm in just a perfect way. This is an exquisitely designed street. Let me ask you some questions about these people here. How thick was their zoning code? How many boards and committees did they have to go to get approval to build something? How many federal grants did they get? How many state programs were there? How many miles of infrastructure did they put in order to attract this growth? How much tax subsidy did they give out? How many engineers and planners and economic development advisors did they have on staff? We can go through the litany of things that we have convinced ourselves are absolutely essential to building successful places today. They had none of them, none. Yet look at what they built. These were a bunch of illiterate lumberjacks in the middle of nowhere. They didn't even have 30-year mortgages. How did they do this? How did they do this? It's really simple. They just copied what they knew worked. They looked around at the materials they had at hand, and they copied a style and a pattern of development that they had seen be successful around the world for thousands and thousands of years. They copied what they knew worked. When we look at this same street today, after all the growth programs, after all the incentives, after all the investments, after all the professional advice, here's what it now looks like. It's a wasteland of parking lots and half-occupied buildings. And if you want to understand in one photo why our cities are struggling today just to do basic things, understand there's $500,000 of public infrastructure in that little stretch of street there. Where's the wealth that sustains that generation after generation? I was giving a lecture in Boise, Idaho, and I showed this slide. And a student raised their hand and stood up and said, Chuck, I'm from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a very poor country. We can't afford to build the way you do here in the United States. When we build, we have to build one block at a time. And before we build the next block, we have to make sure that everything is filled in on the block we just built, or we won't be able to afford it. We're a very poor country. We can't afford to build this way. We're a very poor country now, too. We can't afford to build this way either. And for a long period of time, that illusion of wealth made us think that this kind of thing didn't matter. That we could walk away from whole parts of our cities, that we could have miles and miles of stuff in the ground that had no return. We were so rich and so wealthy that we didn't even bother to do basic math on this stuff. We're no longer a rich country, and we no longer have the luxury of looking at these places as if they don't matter. So how do we start thinking differently? The first thing we have to do is get rid of some really bad habits. Build it and they will come is a fantastic movie plot. It is a horrible economic development strategy. We are in what we at Strong Towns call the desperation phase of the suburban experiment. The phase where we're so desperate for growth that we ask our cities to do just ridiculous things, right? If you want to be a player in the game today, as a city, what do you have to do? You have to have a team standing by, ready to hand out subsidies to whoever comes to town. You've got to have shovel-ready sites. You've got to have millions of dollars of infrastructure in the ground. What if Google trolls through town? You've got to be able to hook them in, right? You've got to have millions on ante, right? If you want to be taken seriously in the economic development, growth, and jobs game today. This is not how cities build wealth. And this is not how cities have ever built wealth. I'm going to show you the very simple way that cities build wealth. Does this street look familiar to any of you? Does it look like any place you might know? If I told you this was Minneapolis, would that surprise you? I mean, I could say Baton Rouge, but the trees are obviously not native to here, right? But there's certainly a picture of Baton Rouge that looks like this at some point, right? If I said Chicago or San Francisco or Vancouver, would that surprise you? No, right? Because they all started this way. Every city that was built prior to our latest auto experiment began just like this, right? Some pop-up buildings, a little hope and a dream. This could be Dallas, could be Chicago, could be Manhattan, right? If we went back far enough in time, there is a scene in London and Paris and Rome exactly like this, right? This could be Romulus and Remus. This is my hometown. This is what it looked like in 1870. 30 years later, this exact street would look like this. But this is what it looked like when it started. We built thousands of these across this continent, and for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places failed. When they failed, what happened? Did unemployment skyrocket? Did the stock market drop? Did we have to have an emergency bailout of Wall Street banks? No. A few people lost a little bit of money, they salvaged what they could, and they moved on to the next city. We built thousands of these across this continent, and for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in a very simple way. They would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. So after 30 years of incremental development, this little pop-up street, this hope and a dream, would become that street that I showed you earlier. And after another 40 years of incrementally growing up, incrementally growing out, and incrementally becoming more intense, these 2- and 3-story wood structures would become buildings with brick and granite facades. We don't build wealth by going to the casino and putting it all on red. The way we build wealth is by making small investments over a broad area, over a long period of time. I'm going to show you how powerful this style of development is. These are 2 identical blocks in my hometown. The one on the left I've labeled old and blighted. The one on the right I've labeled shiny and new. If you look at them, you'll see they're the exact same size, the exact same area. They have the exact same amount of public infrastructure. They're on the same thoroughfare, the same neighborhood. Everything about them is the same except for the style of development upon them. That old and blighted block looks like this. Is the 1920s version of the pop-up block. As my city was growing incrementally out, the next 3 blocks of increment were these 3. So what you are looking at is the cheapest commercial property you could build in the 1920s. And had things continued to progress, it would have eventually had a 2nd story, a 3rd story. It would have become more intense. It would have continued to grow. But that's not what happened, right? After this was built, we had the Depression, we had World War II, and we had a completely different style of development that just skipped right over this and started building out on the edge. These buildings have stagnated for 90 years. 2 blocks over used to look just like this. The city labeled it blight, had it torn down, and now we have the drive-through taco joint. Everybody was thrilled about this transaction. The planner's happy, right? The new building meets the setbacks, the floor area ratios, the sign ordinance. We've got ample parking. The engineer was happy because we got the nasty on-street parking out of the way. Now the cars can flow through more quickly. The environmental people were happy because now we've got some green space and some native plants in the stormwater area. The bike ped people were happy because they got a sidewalk. The sidewalk ends right there, but it runs that stretch. Here's what nobody bothered to consider. That old and blighted block, that rundown junky block we're trying to get rid of, has a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new block, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, has a value of only $800,000. The city actually collects 42% more taxes from that old rundown junky block. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, the way we built places for thousands of years across different cultures and continents and latitudes. You are looking at that in its infancy after 90 years of neglect, and it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we're building brand new today. And we all know the trajectory of the taco joint, right? 20 years from now, there'll be a new taco joint up the road. This one will be turned into a used car lot. A decade later, it will be boarded up. They'll be selling drugs out the back, and we'll be trying to get a grant to have it torn down. We've all been around long enough to see this happen, right? In fact, in the 2 years since we originally did this analysis, this is what has happened to the property values on these two blocks. We see the same kind of thing. Well, we see the same kind of thing on the edge of our cities. This is our big box store. This is our Mills Fleet Farm. You guys don't have Mills here in Louisiana. You're missing out. When you walk in Mills, you've got auto parts, animal feed, lumber, guns and ammo, camouflage lingerie. That's the product mix of Mills. It's wildly successful. We had one, we doubled it. It was so successful. This is an auto dealership and a gas station. This is 19 acres. This is the most valuable 19 acres in the entire Brainerd Lakes area. When these people come into a council meeting, we just stop the meeting and ask them, what can we do for you, right? This is 19 acres of our downtown. For those of you that have seen the movie Fargo, you've seen a not so flattering, but not so inaccurate portrayal of my hometown. Most of these second and third stories are unoccupied. Most of the first stories have rotating clientele. It has not had a new building built in this 19 acres in my lifetime. Lots that have burned down though and are now parking lots. When we look out on the edge of town, we see a land use pattern that yields $0.6 million per acre. It's a huge amount of money. Yet when we go downtown, 19 acres, same size area, but just a different configuration. We see a land use pattern that's 78% more valuable. We all intuitively understand. When we look at this, we realize that we spent $150 million on a bypass, right? We spent tens of millions to get the sewer and water out to this point. Heck, when I was an engineer, I actually designed this. That was $2.6 million. Millions more for this road, millions for the frontage road. My generation has spent nothing on this. Nothing. That was wealth that my great-great-grandparents and their contemporaries built slowly and incrementally over time, and then bequeathed to us as a sort of an endowment for the community, right? And we've slowly milked it down. We know that when Mills Fleet Farm goes out of business, whatever comes next is not going to be nearly as valuable, right? This is a very limited financial upside here. It's going to be a Salvation Army or a church or something. But whatever it is not going to pay nearly as much taxes. Yet, there's 134 different properties in this 19 acres. When one of them loses a tenant, when one of them has someone move out, when one of them, closes up their business, we know what can happen in those spaces, right? They're highly flexible, they're highly adaptable. I've seen businesses in the downtown go from being a pizza place to a retailer to an accountant's office. This type of transition happens all the time. You have a development pattern out here on the edge that not only is financially very unproductive, but it's incredibly fragile. And you have a development pattern here in the downtown that not only is financially really, really productive, has incredible financial upside, very limited downside, but it's highly adaptable and resilient. There is a reason people built this way for thousands of years. When we look across the country, we see the same thing in city after city after city. A colleague and friend of mine named Joe Minicozy does these fantastic maps. If you think of a farm field, you plant seed across a field and some areas grow taller than others. We call that the productivity of that farm field, right? We do the same thing for cities and say, where are we getting the most financial return? Where's the financial return greatest? This is Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York is one of those cities that was hollowed out after World War II. It's lost population every census since 1940. Yet when we ask the question, where's the wealth in Buffalo, we see that it is in their old traditional walkable downtown. And it's not like it's just a little bit there. It kills it, right? It destroys everything around it. We can go to smaller cities like this one in upstate New York, about 60,000. We see the same kind of pattern. We can go to even really small cities like this one near where I live. This is a city of 1,200. When I first went here, they said, we got some really great stuff going on out here. We've got some really great stuff going on out here, but these neighborhoods are terrible. We've got to figure out a way to get this stuff torn down and replaced. Then we showed them where all their wealth was. In those poor neighborhoods with the poor people. That's where all their wealth was. We've been doing a study with the city of Lafayette, and this afternoon, myself and some officials from there are going to talk a little bit more about it in specificity. I'm going to give you this map just as a preview of that conversation. This is the first map in the country, and I would venture to say the world, but I'm not as informed on the world as I am on the country in this regard. So let's just stick with the country for now. This is the first map of this intensity that's ever been done in this country. We went to Lafayette and poured through their data and their records. We met intensely with their staff, and we developed what is a net kind of map. We looked at all their revenue sources and all their sources of expense that we could categorize and put to a parcel. And so what you are looking at is a parcel by parcel analysis of where the city of Lafayette is cash flow positive and where the city of Lafayette is cash flow negative. Green is cash flow positive, red is cash flow negative. Let me interpret this map for you in brief. We can talk about it more this afternoon. You have the historical downtown and the poor people. You have the big box stores, the suburban subdivisions with the 3-car garages, and the strip malls. This map, to me, represents two subsidies, two very real subsidies. Subsidy number one is from the poorer neighborhoods to the wealthier neighborhoods. Subsidy number two is from the future to today. Because the city of Lafayette, the typical resident pays about $750 a year taxes to the city. In order to maintain all the stuff that the city has committed themselves to maintaining, that bill would have to be over $8,000 a year. That's not going to happen. And so lots of this stuff is never going to be fixed and never going to be maintained. And so the people today are able to live and enjoy, and I say enjoy, in air quotes, they're able to have a certain style and a pattern of development today that is not going to be available to generations in the future because it's not financially viable. There's a subsidy because the people in the future are going to have to figure out, and are being asked today to figure out already, how to unwind all this stuff, how to unwind it. How do you pay for a $45 million backlog of road maintenance when your annual road maintenance budget is $300,000? Those are the questions we're facing with today. And those are the easy questions. They're only going to get harder. When we look at what this development looks like, it gives us an insight as to how we start to deal with this. These are from North Carolina. We see a Walmart or a Kmart at $384,000 an acre, a Walmart at $967,000 an acre. They were so proud of these because they had given them subsidies. They had run the sewer and water out to here at the cost of millions. They had built an interchange, all this stuff to get all this great growth. Yet when we go to the downtown and we look, you've got an old warehouse building that's converted into a supper club at over $5 million an acre, and my favorite, Jimmy's Pizza, at 3.4 million an acre. Now here's my question for you. When we step back and we look at the landscapes of our cities, and we actually get out of our car and walk, so we start to perceive all the gaps, all the spaces, all the unused, untapped potential that's there. And we look at this. Do we have what it takes? Do we have the intelligence, the moxie, the wherewithal to build something as exquisite and refined as Jimmy's Pizza? Because if we do, we can build an enormous amount of wealth in our cities. I actually think we can do better. I think we can do a lot better than that, right? But if that was our standard, if that's all we had to do, was go out and fill those empty spaces with buildings like that, look at the wealth we'd be creating, right? And not only the wealth we'd be creating, but everybody in this room intuitively understands where the profits for these places end up, right? These are big sucking machines for our communities. And while they do create jobs and while they do create opportunities, we know where the excess wealth, and that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about a city, we're talking about where does our excess wealth go, we know where it ends up. Where does the excess wealth in Jimmy's Pizza end up? It ends up with Jimmy, right? And where does Jimmy bank? And where's Jimmy's accountant located? And who does Jimmy use as an attorney? And where is Jimmy's advertising people, right? We all intuitively understand what's going on here. When we look at the fine grain, we see enormous amounts of opportunity. This is, I forgot to put this in because I thought this was an important one for you guys. This is something we call a Strode. A Strode is a street road hybrid. This is the futon of transportation. If you think of a futon as an uncomfortable couch that makes into an uncomfortable bed, this is a piece of transportation that's trying to do two things at once and doing neither of them very well, right? A road is a replacement of the railroad. You can think of it as a road on rails, right? And in a railroad, you got on at one spot, you got off on another. There's a high-speed connection between the two. You didn't have frontage railroads, you don't have drive-through railroads. It's a high-speed connection between two places. And when we build infrastructure that's a high-speed connection between two places, it works really well. But here, we've put in a ton of investment to move people from one place to another. We have 4 highway-scaled lanes. We have a center turn lane to get that through traffic out of the way so we can speed through quickly. We've made an enormous investment to move cars very, very quickly here. Does anyone get to move quickly? No, right? Because we have low speed limits, we have a traffic signal that forces you to just sit there. And so even though we've made this enormous investment, nobody gets to move very quickly. What is a street? A street is, and always has been, a platform for building wealth. A street is a platform for building wealth. And when we look at this, we've made investments here to try to make this a more wealth-producing street, right? We have wide sidewalks, we have decorative lights, we put out banners and benches and street planters, and right? Is this street creating a lot of wealth? No, because if you're shopping here and you're gonna shop over here, you don't walk across 7 lanes of traffic, right? You don't walk down and then sit and wait and wait and wait and then cross over and walk. What do? You get in your car, you whip a U-turn and you come over here. And the businesses all get that, right? They all know that. And so what do? They put in parking lots and drive-throughs, and you get a return on investment that is more like that shiny and new taco joint than that old and blighted block. This fails as a street. Stroads are the default way we go about building places today. This is the default transportation investment that we make. I want to show you that you have the capacity and the understanding to do things differently, to actually build places that are financially productive and successful. When engineers go out and they build infrastructure, they go out and build a street or a road, we have a very set way that we go about doing it. The first thing we say is, all right, what is the design speed? What's the speed that we're expected to handle? What is the volume of traffic that is projected for this? Given that speed and that volume, what does the manual say is a safe section to build, and how much is that going to cost? This is the way engineers approach design. I want you to tell me how you would approach design. And I want you to think about the streets in your community, the places where you live, where you shop, where you work, where your kids are going to be hanging out, falling in love, doing all that. Think about these places and think about what you would like them to be like. Of these 4 values, I'm going to ask you to say this out loud. Of these 4 values, which one of these would be most important to you? Would it be that we would move traffic at speed, that we would move a high volume of traffic, that we would build environments that were safe, or that we would build places in a cost-effective way? Is it speed, volume, safety, or cost? Safety. Right? If you had to prioritize then, would it be moving vehicles at speed, moving a high volume of vehicles, or would it be that your investments be cost effective? Would it be speed, volume, or cost? I can't change these, right? Would you rather move cars at speed, or would you rather move a high volume of cars? If you had to prioritize, is it speed or volume? Do you see what we did here? I can't change these. You guys say the same thing everybody else says. We all intuitively know and understand what has to happen if we're going to build successful places. If we're going to build great places, we all understand how that needs to be done. We actually have to prioritize safety over speed. Speed is our top design criteria right now. It has to become our bottom design criteria. We have to actually compromise on speed. Speeds have to go down in order for the environments that we're going to build to not only be safe, but to be productive and successful. We can do this. We understand these values, right? When we look around this country at successful places, they all have one thing in common. One thing jumps out at us as being kind of the defining characteristic of successful places. When we travel and visit them, we see one thing over and over again. What is it? People. People are the indicator species of success. If you have built a place that is financially successful and working, what you will see over and over again is people. People show up, people inhabit it, people are there. If you don't see people, your place is not likely financially viable over the long term. I want to talk a little bit about, in closing, the way we go about making investments today. This is a street in Memphis, Tennessee called Broad Avenue. Broad Avenue was an old streetcar stop. In the 1950s, they ripped out the streetcars, they ran highways through the middle of the neighborhood, and this place just died, just went away. Some neighbors, fed up with the decline, fed up with the neglect, went out, took matters into their own hands, and working with the business owners, swept out the stores, swept up the sidewalks. They painted crosswalks, they painted bike lanes, they put up planters and benches. For one weekend, they invited businesses to come in and open up and show what this place could be like. They had an art gallery come in, they had a bike shop come in, an ice cream place, clothier. They had a whole lineup. And when they got done, this wasn't the greatest block in all of Memphis, but it was a heck of a lot better than what had been there before, a bunch of vacant, empty buildings. I wasn't out here when this happened, but I was out here 6 months later. When I was out here, every single storefront was fully occupied. I talked to one of the landlords. He said he was able to charge double the amount of rent for the last place than he was asking before the project. The city has gone out and documented 18 new businesses, 32 new jobs, $12 million of property value appreciation, all from a total public investment of zero. We call this at Strong Towns chaotic but smart. The bottom-up processes that make our cities strong, renew them over time. In my hometown, we were so inspired by the Memphis example that we started our own group called A Better Brainerd. We went out and worked in that neighborhood with the Taco Johns and the Old and Blighted block. We spent a year out there just observing where people struggled. We tried different things. We put in bike lanes and measured the speeds that the automobiles drove before and after. We put in crosswalks to see if it would help people get across the street. We put up flags and did different little experiments to see. We saw the mom walking with the stroller through the ditch. We went up and asked her, what are you doing? Well, I have to get to the grocery store and get milk. I don't have a car today. I have to go. It doesn't feel safe walking in the street, so I'm walking here. We saw the elderly woman walking down the middle of the street with a walker, climbing over mounds of snow. What are you doing? Well, I have to get to the pharmacy. I don't have a choice. The sidewalk's not shoveled, and there's not even a sidewalk in this part here, so I have to walk here. We started to document these things. We started to observe where people struggle and document it. And at the end of a year, we put out a little report called Neighborhoods First. Our report recommended 8 projects that the city could do that would directly address the places where we saw people struggling in this neighborhood. Little things like paint a crosswalk, put in a bike lane, plant a row of trees. My city is currently undertaking a $7 million project to run sewer and water 1.5 miles out of town to the airport to build a second industrial park. The first one's not full, but this one would be air-oriented, which is a special significance. And the idea here is that this would create well-paying jobs and growth and economic development that everyone would prosper from. The total cost of our projects, $16,700. What happens if the city goes out, spends $16,700 on little improvements to help make people's lives better, and nothing results from it? Nobody says, well, this is a nicer neighborhood. Well, I'd really like to live in this neighborhood. Boy, this neighborhood is up and coming. I'm gonna fix up my house a little bit or do something on this vacant lot. What if they do that and nothing happens? Well, we're out $16,700, right? But we've learned 8 things that won't work. But I think they will, right? I mean, I went to the city engineer and I said, I think you could use a sidewalk here. You know what he said? Why would you say that, Chuck? We have been so obsessed with getting that dollar out on the edge of our cities, with chasing it, that we are overlooking the pennies and the nickels and the dimes. They're just waiting to be picked up in our neighborhoods. And if we can stop and step back and focus on the places where people struggle, if we can observe humbly and try our best to meet those needs in a minimal amount of way, right? What's the next smallest thing we can do? Not only will we be making the highest returning investments possible, but we'll be making people's lives better in the process. Thank you so much. If you're interested, the website I've got up here with the chat /, you can get a copy of these slides and some other things. I think there's actually like an audio, video copy of this presentation. If you're interested in that, you can actually go right now on your phone and do that. If you're interested, strongtowns.org. We still do the blog. We used to do it 3 times a week. Now we do it 3 times a day. Do a podcast twice a week and videos routinely as well. We are a member-driven organization, so if you're interested in our work, we're going to have our member drive actually next week, so you're just in time to sign up and help us share this message around the country. We're trying to create 1 million people who care enough to share our message, and when we do, we believe we'll see the change that we're trying to bring about. So thank you so much. Do we have a little bit of time for? We have 3 minutes. If there's a burning question or two. Otherwise, we are doing the session in the afternoon, and we'll be happy to chat then. Please, sir. Okay.
Except for the folks in this room, I don't really think we're having a discussion
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Please.
In urban areas where you have multiple jurisdictions, what I see going on is competition for retail sales. So I think you were more focused on property tax revenues, but what they're looking at is if I can get Walmart in my area, I can get retail sales from the adjacent areas. So it's all chasing the real estate development dollars. How do you put a stop to that?
It's a really good question. Some of our analyses, the early ones were just property, but the later ones did include retail taxes. We've looked at retail taxes, and essentially the map looks the same. I think your question, though, is a really good one. How do we put a stop to this? I think it's important to understand that there's a difference between a market, which is an open market, and then market where you set the rules. A market, by definition, has rules, right? And there are rules of how we trade and how things are done. Right now, most of our governments have set up this rule that essentially cannibalizes their own cities. It forces them in a race to the bottom. It is a very logical thing to subsidize a big box store all the way down to the point, theoretically, where you would make $1 off of it, because if you don't do it, that $1 will go to your neighbor and you will get zero. So we've created a tax system and a tax structure that forces cities or induces cities to do really, I'm going to say stupid things, but things that are destructive because they are in their own interest. I mean, that's the thing, is we look at this and say, oh my gosh, this is really dumb that you're doing this, but yet there's a short-term financial incentive for doing it that is powerful and overwhelming. I personally think, and I don't want to use Minnesota as like a great example because there's ways to screw this up horribly, which we have done. But when it comes to that kind of sales tax, doing it on a more regional basis is a lot more effective way to do it. Because you get rid of that city-to-city competition. I mean, literally Walmart moves 1,000 feet and can cut their costs way down at the expense of taxpayers in both communities. That's not a good thing, yet that's a system we've created. So I would more, if I were going to use, I would rely less on sales tax, and if I were going to rely on it, I would have it collected more regionally and then distributed back to cities as a function of their population or some other thing like that. So you get away from that, like, most destructive of practices. That gets into a whole conversation on taxes, which we could talk for an hour on that. Property taxes are incredibly destructive. Land taxes are not a perfect solution, but are a much better option. Retail taxes are fine if you have a more regional thing. Cities that have income taxes actually have a more stable income stream. Although once you get like a diversity of taxes, people start to freak out because it's easier to kind of bump things up and not deal with reality quickly enough. If there's one overriding thought on taxes, it's this. I think cities need to be given a lot more flexibility than they have today to put mechanisms in place that work for them. We see cities that are mining cities have the same taxes as tourism cities, have the same tax structure as manufacturing cities, have the same tax structure as agricultural cities, and they have vastly different economies. How can you have the same tax structure? So we need a lot more flexibility at the local level. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and let's have another round of applause for Chuck Marohn.